Hello everyone. This week we'll be covering the Upanishads, their historical context, and their metaphysical implications. Please bear with me on the Sanskrit terms. I don't know how to pronounce these. I'm going to do my best. We'll briefly discuss 3 of the Upanishads as examples. We will also cover 3 chapters from Purifying the Earthly Body of God. 3 chapters cover karmic theory, attitudes to nature, and a critique of Advaita Vedanta's ecological implications. That's a school of Hinduism. We'll try and find answers to the following questions at the end of the lecture. How does Vedic Upanishad literature conceive of the material world and humanity's relationship to it? How does early Hindu philosophy impact the development of ecological consciousness in Hinduism? And how various historical developments impacted that? First, the historical context. The Upanishads. The fundamental insight of the Upanishads is Atman and Brahman are one. Okay, so Atman is the self and Brahman is, ultimate reality of the cosmos. They are fundamental sacred texts in the Hindu tradition. The Upanishad has came to mean over time secret knowledge or doctrine. The Upanishads document the transition from the archaic ritualism of the Veda into new religious ideas and institutions. Core aspects of contemporary Hinduism emerged at this time, including the doctrine of rebirth, the law of karma, and the techniques of liberation. These are complex documents composed by many authors over a period of approximately 600 years. There were significant social, economic, and religious changes happening during the time that they were written, and we will cover some of those. Characteristics of the Upanishads, to be distinguished from the older Vedas. The Upanishads are more metaphysical and cosmological. They are more recent. There's less emphasis on sacrifice and ritual, and they are more overall esoteric, right? So metaphysical, esoteric, more experiential. So, to understand them, first I want to cover some basic aspects of the Vedic tradition out of which they developed. The Vedic tradition. The Upanishads grew out of the Vedic tradition in northern India, which was a fusion of indigenous Harappan and migrant Aryan culture. It is nearly impossible to differentiate Aryan cultural influences from the indigenous Harappan cultural influences. The Vedic tradition created the caste system in India, and the early economy of the Vedic era was primarily agricultural. It was village-based until the 6th century BCE, when kingdoms began to arise. This is around also the time that the Upanishads were written, during the urbanization period, post-village life, after the collapse of the Harappan civilization. And they obviously wrote the Vedas. Okay? Social geographical context of the Upanishads. They are written in the last few centuries BCE, written in northern India, and they appear to have been written in an urban or urbanizing environment rather than in a village environment. This is significant. They make almost no agricultural metaphors and make extensive use of craft metaphors. This is evidence of their, urban or proto-urban origin. The Upanishads are part of the Vedas, and they are some of the basic scriptures of Hinduism. It is also apparent from the Upanishads that long-distance travel and therefore cultural blending was possible. Some of the material consists of dialogues, debates, and formal teachings by famous teachers of the time in northern India. These teachers are known through other sources as well. So we know that they're spread over a large area, and they eventually were consolidated down into these Upanishads. So that means there was communication and travel, at least in northern India. All right, next, the Brahmanas. What are those? The Brahmanas are the different branches of Brahmin schools beginning in the 8th century BCE. The Brahmanas are also the name of the prose texts explaining the meaning of the liturgy for each school. The Brahmanas correspond with the 4 branches of the Vedas, and each branch was associated with a school of Brahmins. Each Vedic branch had its own collection of texts and its own Brahmana, or explanation of the rituals. These texts included the Upanishads, and were originally the Upanishads and these earlier traditions were distributed across the various branches, the various Brahmanas. The Upanishads later became detached from the individual Vedic branches and became the common property of all Brahmins. They were given the generic title Vedanta, which means end or conclusion. In other words, they were considered the essence of the Vedas. So now all the Brahmanas were using the Upanishads in addition to their individual Vedic texts. Okay, so a little bit of cultural context for the Upanishads. We'll have a little discussion of Vedic cosmology. There are 3 spheres in Vedic cosmology: the sky, the intermediate, where humans and animals and everything lives, and the earth. This is common with other Indo-European peoples. Quote, "The central concern of all Vedic thinkers, including the authors of the Upanishads, is to discover the connections that bind elements of these 3 spheres to each other. Originally, each sphere was associated with specific gods. Over time, all gods came to be associated with the sky. There are 3 worlds in the Vedic cosmology: the world of humans, the world of ancestors, and the world of gods. This is relevant to the concept of rebirth, which first appears in a coherent way in the Upanishads. So, Upanishads introduce rebirth as a fundamental part of Hinduism. Rebirth originally in the Veda, all humans that led a ritually correct life would go to the world of the fathers, which is the realm of the ancestors, I believe. Later in the Upanishads, only those who were destined to be reborn would go to the world of the fathers. Those that achieve liberation go to the world of the gods. And this requires the concept of rebirth. This is the whole cycle of birth and rebirth and reincarnation and shedding karma and moksha and release and all that stuff that is developed in the Upanishads. There's some proto-seeds in the Vedas, but it's really developed to fuller fruition in the Upanishads. Next, 2 key concepts of the Vedic cosmology. Number 1, Atman. Atman has many meanings in the Upanishads. Most common is the self, the ultimate essence of a human being. The next essential concept is Brahman. Brahman has a variety of meanings, the ultimate and basic essence of the cosmos. Quote, "That from which beings are born, on which, once born, they live, and into which they pass upon death to perceive that." They pass upon death, seek to perceive that. That is Brahman. The things that all things come from and all things return to. And those are the kind of key aspects you need to have in place to understand what's being talked about in the Upanishads. So now, into the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. This is the oldest Upanishad, part of the Satapatha Brahmayana. Again, pardon my pronunciation. There were 3 editorial phases of this document. The first was individual passages, dialogues, and stories. The second, 3 independent collections, right? One of passages, one of dialogues, one of stories. And then third phase is all the sections were woven together and then included in the Satapatha Brahmana. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad constitutes 2/3 of the corpus of ancient Upanishadic documents. So it's big. It has a lot of content. The types of content in it are horse sacrifice, breath, the world is body, the 3 worlds, sleep, Atman, Brahman, rebirth, and rituals of daily life. There's more, but this is a very comprehensive document and includes a lot of material. It's one of the foundation. This one and the Chandogya Upanishad apparently are 2 of the foundational documents in Advaita Vedanta and other traditions as well. So, next, the Taittiriya Upanishad. I have no idea if that's how it's pronounced. It's a supplement to the Taittiriya Brahmana. There are 3 chapters: a chapter on instruction, a chapter on bliss, and a chapter of Burgu, which apparently is, I think, someone's name they're conversing with. It's an instruction manual for ritual and an explanation of liturgy. Now, the last Upanishad we'll go over is the Aitreya Upanishad, second book of the Aitreya Arankaya from Aitreya Brahmana, calls itself Samhita Upanishad. Speculations on the Rig Vedic recitation. So it's kind of a document of practice, talking about various aspects of ritual. All right, so that's kind of an overview, specifically the Upanishads. We're going to move in now to the chapters of the earthly body of God. The first chapter we're going to go over is chapter 2, Karma Theory. The environmental crisis in full bloom in India. The The environmental crisis is a contemporary challenge. It was not present in the same way for previous generations. There was environmental degradation, but not on the scale that we're dealing with. There was no industrialization. So on this scale, it's a new question, which we have to answer. Quote, the catastrophe of Bhopal, the Bombay smog, the pollution of the Ganges, the acid rain deterioration of the Taj Mahal make it clear that the environmental crisis has reached full flower in India. The Bhagavad Gita speaks of the cosmos as God's body. So, and karmic theory is a basic presupposition for Jain, Hindu, and Buddhist thought. Hinduism maintains there is no fundamental separation between humans and the natural world. According to karmic theory, all things, minerals, plants, animals, people, etc., are composed of souls trapped by different types of karma. Karma is composed of material traces of past actions that adhere to the soul and cause it to reincarnate in mineral, plant, animal, or human forms. Karma weighs down the soul and causes it to reincarnate in lower forms. So the goal is to get out, right? To shed your karma and be released, right? And if you accumulate more karma, you kind of move down the hierarchy into lower forms. Karmic theory is the basis for the Hindu reverence for all forms of life, even inorganic ones. Popular conceptions of karma are usually deterministic, but free will actually plays a significant role in karmic theory. This creates a moral responsibility in the individual to choose how they respond to their karma. Karma is created like a habit, and it is built through repeated actions. It is the responsibility of the individual to make choices that do not create karma, like destroying the biosphere, maybe doing violence, being passions, right? Getting attached to the world. Karma is a predisposition and not a cause of behavior. So it's a tendency. It isn't a deterministic thing. We are all morally responsible for the good or evil thoughts or actions towards the environment that we freely choose during our lifetime. Individual karma affects not just us and our future lives, but also the environment and all other beings of which we exist as an interconnected part. Karma theory binds humans into continuity with natural processes. When human freedom is emphasized, it is a freedom circumscribed with moral responsibility to the environment, which each of us is intimately interconnected. Quote, importing Western concepts such as deep ecology is therefore unnecessary because India already has a deep ecological tradition in its native Hinduism. Okay, chapter 3, attitudes to nature in the early Upanishads. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, there is no denial of the world and nature as appears later in Advaita Vedanta. Quote, verily, as one wishes non-injury for his own world, so all beings wish non-injury for him who has this knowledge. End quote. Radhakrishnan's commentary, quote, the earth and all living beings are mutually dependent. Chandogya Upanishad, a particularly alluring attitude towards nature. Quote, the earth, as it were, is in a state of meditation. So it's definitely, there's like a sacred dimension to the earth. The attitudes of the early Upanishads did influence the later traditions. Although Advaita Vedanta, which uses the early Upanishads as central text, denies the reality of the world, and it makes the reverence of nature impossible, there are other schools that do not do this. The Buddhist doctrine of co-origination was perhaps anticipated by the Chandogya Upanishad. Ironically, Advaita uses the Chandogya as a basic fundamental document, but interprets it differently. Okay, last chapter, chapter 4. The dualism of non-dualism, Advaita Vedanta, and the irrelevance of nature. Quote, all this world, verily, is Brahman, the absolute. End quote. Advaita, non-dualist Vedanta, was founded by Shankara in the 8th century CE. It has been dominant for more than 1,000 years, and it encourages attitudes of devaluation and neglect of the natural universe. It has been long known for its ascetic denial of the world in favor of spirit. This has to do with shedding karma, getting out, all that stuff. It has occasionally been romanticized in the West as ecological in its orientation because it believes all is Brahman, right? Atman equals Brahman. This is a misinterpretation of Advaita, however. It is not the kind of non-dualism that those searching for ecologically supportive modes of thought might wish it to be, end quote. And now here are the reasons why. Denial of intrinsic worth. Quote, since the self is the highest object of love, one should become indifferent to all objects of experience and transfer one's love to the self. In this way of thinking, value is located in the self alone. The world is an illusion and distraction from Atman. Fear of change, nature, and multiplicity. Eliade, quote, when the sense of the religiousness of the cosmos has become lost, cyclic time becomes terrifying. This is interesting because of the cycle of rebirth that is at the core of Indian spirituality. If the world isn't sacred, you want to get out, right? Otherwise, you're stuck here forever, going in circles, right? So this is what Eliade is trying to point out. Okay, quote, Shankara and his disciples see the universe of birth and rebirth, samsara, as a terrible ocean infested with sea monsters. In it we are drowning, and from it we need rescue. Quote, the universe is not a community, but a hierarchy in which gods enjoy great happiness, human beings experience moderate happiness and pain, and animals suffer extreme misery. End quote. Okay? Objectification and devaluation of nature. Since Maya, the creative power of Brahman, and all its products, including mind, are insentient, the universe as universe is unconscious and inert, end quote. Because Advaita rejects the world as illusion, it is unconcerned with ecological considerations. Quote, the defects of the body, mind, and objects of experience are innumerable. The discriminating have no more liking for them than for milk porridge vomited by a dog. Okay, there it is, World is gross, right? You want to get out, okay? Now, why? Non-duality through denial. Non-duality as rejection rather than as acceptance. Advaita denies the world rather than accepting it as just one manifestation of a greater totality. In Advaita, there is no reconciliation between the eternal and the temporal. We never find in Advaita a vision of the world as the moving face of divinity, right? Like, this is a Platonic idea, but, also expressed in other traditions. Quote, all that is made of clay is considered clay, identical with its cause, but only the clay is real. So the forms are unreal, right? They're distractions, they're illusion, they're a lie, right? The reality is only the clay, the stuff, right? So, one more quote. The world of nature and all its creatures may appear before the mind of ignorance, but in truth they are not there. Despite appearances, the idea that any being ever comes into existence is false. So there's a profound disengagement with the world, which of course, conflicts with the idea of environmental concern. It's just an illusion. The vision of the knower. Does the evaluation of nature change with liberation? So what if you become enlightened in Advaita? Does that change it? Do you close the lid? Do you come back around and be like, hey, Atman is Brahman, the world is sacred, right? Does that happen? Advaita presents a radical discontinuity between reality and nature, in which the later is utterly devalued. Phenomena may continue in the state of living liberation, but insofar as they do, they are experienced as false perceptions, irritating intrusions of a remote, inexplicable, empirical other into the self-luminous fullness of the self. Quote. Bottom line, the world still appears dualistic after enlightenment. You just have to, deal with it. It's not real. You identify with the Atman, but everything still looks, dualistic, so it still needs to be rejected. Dissolution of the world. Advaita affirms a total rejection of the world revealed by the senses. An Advaitin sage must not act, lest he or she is fooled again into generating karma in the world. Quote, the liberated sage whose karma requires him to bear temporal existence yet longer suffers, like someone enduring forced labor, end quote. Conclusion. Advaita affirms a sort of acosmic monism. It denies the existence of the world in an effort to identify with the one real totality called Brahman. Only God, or Brahman, is fully real. The divine is untouched by the pollution of the world, and the natural universe is ultimately unimportant. Quote, it is difficult to see in such modes of thought anything less than an extreme version of the world negating transcendental dualism that supports environmental neglect. I personally saw many parallels to the various pathologies in the West that we all are kind of aware of in Advaita Vedanta. I could see, anthropocentrism, dualism, very common Western themes. In fact, there's a very strong theoretical connection to Platonic thought, Greek thought. Anyway, that's a whole different subject. So now, end of the lecture. Let's get back to the questions. Let's see if we've got some answers. All right. How does Vedic Upanishadic literature conceive of the material world and humanity's relationship to it? Atman equals Brahman. The self is the same as ultimate reality, so it's within us. We have that within us. The world as it appears is Maya, illusion, and Brahman is ultimately real. So things aren't as they appear. World is controlled by gods who can be contacted through sacrificial rituals. That's the Vedas. Everything in the material world, organic and inorganic, is made of souls and trapped by karma. Therefore, there is no dead matter. So the whole world is souls, bound up with various, karmic influences. Hence, no significant separation of humans from the natural world. Karma will determine if a human is reborn as a plant or is released from the cycle of birth and death into Brahman. Okay? Next, final question. How does early Hindu philosophy impact the development of ecological consciousness in Hinduism? And how have various historical developments impacted that? The development is complex. It branches out into different spiritual traditions over time. Advaita Vedanta denies the existence of the world as an illusion and seeks to retreat from it altogether. It is thus indifferent to environmental destruction. Other schools are more ecologically affirming, other Hindu schools, as well as, Mahayana Buddhism and Jainism, which are both, further developments of the tradition. It's known that the self, the world is full of selves. It's animate in some sense. There's the animism of the earlier Dravidian traditions comes through versus the dualism of the Aryan tradition. So it closes the loop at the end. Yes, the world is illusion, but the world is also self. So if the world is self, then the world is reality as much as the self is reality. If the Atman's real, the world is real, right? But it isn't actually how it seems. It's more than what it seems. What we see isn't the way it really is. It's just, this is one aspect of it, and we have to see through that to see Brahman, the bigger picture. That's my interpretation. Okay, early fusion of Aryan and Harappan cultures during the early Vedic period. Later, urban regrowth during the writing of the Upanishads. And the identification of the self with the world creates the potential for reverence of nature and thus ecological consciousness. Okay, so thanks for sticking with me. I know this was a little bit longer than I anticipated, but it's kind of a lot of material and I did not want to skim over it. The Upanishads are extremely important and I wanted to make sure I gave them a worthy treatment. So thanks for sticking around for 23 minutes and I'm looking forward to the discussions in the forums. Take care.